What's up, you heathens and demons? Let me get all this crap off. If you can't tell, I am really stoned. What's up, CJ? You just came in at the right time. All right, here we go. What's up, you heathens and demons?
Hey, I got a quick question.
Before this.
Does it say "Make America Drunk Again"?
Yeah, I'm actually wearing it right now as well.
That's honestly hilarious. I love that.
People like this hat. I can't figure out why.
I think it's just, I don't know. There's something comical about it that's almost like not necessarily explainable, I guess. It's kind of like I saw this guy with a red hat that was like that. It said "Made You Look." And I don't know why, but it just cracked me up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I saw one like that too, and I want to get one because it could, like, a red hat now is suspect from the beginning. I just got this red hat, Hogwarts alumni, blah blah blah, and everybody does second takes on it, and I'm like, nope, it's not a Trump hat. But yeah, the funny story about this one is I got it at or my cousin actually got it for me at a NASCAR race, if you can imagine it, back before they banned the Confederate flag, and they loved that shit back then. So that was kind of surprising to me that he bought it there.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, of course, I do also wonder. I've had conversations with some Trumpists, I guess as I would call them, who definitely do seem to be a little bit consistent with their insults in the sense that, like, oh yeah, make fun of the Donnie. It's not the majority by any stretch, but
there's a huge difference between a NASCAR race up here in Michigan and down south, because I've been to both, and a very, very big difference. But I kind of messed up my intro and all that. I just had a friend over right before the stream started, and that hardly ever happens. So we were token down, but this should be a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to it. I know you had some issues with my review of you and Smokey. There is some context to that, and hopefully everybody can hear me well. What's up, chat? Rational Canadian Atheist, Geo Sam just made this let me figure it out. How do I do it? Right there somewhere. That new Rage logo. So thank you, Geo Sam. Agnostic Pagan Mom. And I'm sure more will be joining us. Sundays are always usually an iffy day, but it does seem to be picking up again. So hopefully it'll get back to what it was. So and I just talked to Sokka today, guys. So Sokka should be coming on the channel soon. And I have landed, as I announced it this morning. If you wasn't here, Godless Engineer will be on the channel Thursday night to have a discussion on mythicism. Super stoked. I met KC. This will be the first time meeting GE. So what's up, man? Before we really get started, I'm kind of, you kind of fell into a part of when I was really going back and forth with Smokey, and we have seemed to find some middle grounds. Now there's a reason for that. My audience doesn't know it yet. I'll be putting it out next week. So I'm not going to spoil anything to it, but I've already seen some comments, people commenting, or in the side chat of Scholars chat earlier. I saw people were asking me, hey, Smokey seems to have some respect for you now. So we have found some common ground, and so you kind of fell into a really vicious back and forth vitriol between me and him. And just was unfortunate enough to be in one of his debates when that was happening. So I'll let you start with your criticisms of my review, and then I have a whole shitload of questions I have for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, to be fair, Smokey did actually forewarn me about that. I guess I probably should have taken it slightly more seriously than I did, but also then again, it's probably good not, right? Because now we're here having a good conversation. So
yeah, and I'm hoping to have some positive conversations with Smokey here in the future.
Yeah, and you know what? Actually, speaking of that, he might be joining us today because he asked me if I wanted. I got slapped in the face all of a sudden with like this sudden surge of popularity. I've been Digital Gnosis today. I was on with Skylar yesterday. I'll have Skylar on my program tomorrow. Smokey wants me tomorrow. I got 3 debates on Modern Day Debate lined up in the next 10 days. And it's like, this just came out of nowhere. You know what I mean? So,
well, it's good. I actually think you're an honest interlocutor going into these conversations, and it's really hard to come by here on YouTube. So yeah, I think that even people that were giving you shit in the chat of Skylar's show last night, there was also a lot of people giving you a lot of respect as well. So I mean, I had some questions about that. We'll get to there after yours, but yeah, I think you're gaining respect that's earned because it's really hard to find just honest interlocutors nowadays.
Well, and I appreciate that because I have felt a very similar thing, from my perspective, and I'm sure it's kind of a human thing, of course. There's obviously, I think there are definitely certain ideologies that warrant themselves to being a little bit rougher around the edges. Not that either one of us has that, but I'm just saying that that certainly does happen. But for the most part, it's really not an ideological thing. I mean, a lot of Christians are terrible and not very honest, and a lot of atheists are terrible and not very honest, and left and right, and up and down. And so I appreciate that and feel the sentiment very much.
Cool. So yeah, let's start with your criticisms of my review, and I'll answer anything that you have, and if I'll straight up admit if maybe some of the things I was saying might have been just me really laying it on thick because it's a Smokey thing. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that I wanted to ask about is actually the first comment that I had dropped on your video, which was at I don't remember the timestamp, but that doesn't really matter. Basically, the idea was you were saying that it's like that what human beings do to each other is not necessarily relevant, or that. Well, here, you know what? Let me see, because I can pull up the comment itself. I got to just read exactly what I said. My apologies.
All right, no problem.
As it turns out, this is actually the second comment I made. But nonetheless, so I said, I didn't say it's immoral for one human being to judge another, because I felt there was a little bit of confusion there, that you thought that maybe it was me saying that it's immoral to make judgments per se. But the point that I was actually trying to get across there was that it is immoral for people to judge somebody for the things that they're doing, right? So as an example, let's just hypothetically say I had a problem with debating, right? And I said, that rage, she's always wanting to argue with people. It's nonsense. It's disgusting. I hate it. And then somebody turns on your channel and lo and behold, I'm here debating you, right? It'd be like, yeah, that's not really cool, CJ.
Yeah.
Kind of, and I felt that, and I feel, I should say, that is a very common thing I find amongst secularists, where it's like if human beings, even sometimes the same human beings, right? Like I use the World War II example because it's so obvious, right? We're the same people who nuked the Japanese. We're the same people who encamped the Japanese. We're the same people who had Jim Crow laws. I mean,
this was actually going to be my first question of you. So yeah, continue and then I'll respond.
Yeah, and so my question was basically, or not my question, my point rather, was basically, why is it that all of us have no problem justifying those horrendous those horrendous people in taking other people's lives, when the exact justification we use to not condemn the soldiers, the American soldiers, right, would actually justify the Nazis as well? The Nazis could just as easily say, well, you guys are conquering a bunch of stuff. Well, you guys are racially profiling. Well, you guys are putting people in camps. And it's a self-condemning standard, I think.
Oh, yeah. You had more. I didn't mean. All right. So I think that you probably misspoke it in the stream, because I went back and checked, and you did say exactly that it's wrong. And then you kind of said it just now. It's wrong just to basically judge them based on their ideology without, you should judge them based on their actions. And my retort with that would be the same. And that would be, shouldn't I judge a Nazi just for being a Nazi, right? So, putting it in the context of now in America, a Nazi in the modern age in America, and we'll get to the other point you made. I don't have to know if he did any bad actions to judge him for being a Nazi. The fact that his ideology is being a white supremacist, a Nazi, is enough for me to judge him without knowing his specific actions. He could be a pacifist and never enacted out on that ideology, and I can still judge him for that ideology. And that was my retort, and that's what I would stick to is, if you're saying that you just can't judge the ideology, well, that's kind of what we do with everything. And that's kind of the debate here. That's why finally we're able to have these conversations, because for a long time, these conversations were not allowed. And that's come through a progression of secular society. So to your second point, and that was going to be my first question, because I heard you mention this on Skylar last night. Is it okay when America commits atrocity? And I do agree with you that people do justify those atrocities. I am not one of those. I never have been. I'm of Native American descent. I talk about the genocide all the time. I think that it is reprehensible, and I think that you should not wear rose-colored nationalistic goggles when you're looking at these things. You should recognize the mistakes of the past and never commit them again, and call out your country for it. And I do on a regular. I think that it is immoral if you are sitting there justifying what we did to the Native Americans. It is immoral if you justify what we did to those Japanese people when we threw them in those concentration camps. And it is immoral what we did during slavery. And anybody that would ever justify that, I would say they need to check themselves, because that justification to me is immoral. And you should be fair. If you're going to judge the Nazis for what they did, you have to be able to look at yourselves. So I think that more people need to understand that America is not something great. We are making it great. And I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about the people in our progression. And if we want to get back on track of that, the first thing we got to do is kick Trump's ass out.
Well, and believe me, me and you could go rounds with that, because I actually agree with you from a different ideological perspective, but I am no Trump fan. But don't want to completely derail that, because we really could kill a lot of time with that. So there's a couple things I would say. So first off, just to answer your question plainly, absolutely not. I would not justify any of that sort of stuff. I actually I'm a little bit of in fact, it might even surprise you to know the radical level of my opinions towards the Native American Holocaust. In fact, I refuse to call it anything but, because that is precisely what it is.
Oh yeah. I think the last numbers I looked at, and I'm not sure if I'm exactly accurate, but this is around the number. 97% of the Native American indigenous peoples were wiped off of the American continent. And that's through disease, warfare, and other sources.
Exactly. And one of my personal solution, I guess, if you will, to a lot of this stuff has always been, I do kind of wish there would be something akin to Zionism in the Native American community, where it could just kind of be this idea of that we deserve some kind of a homeland. And I think that's more than fair, especially when you consider like Alaska, Montana, the Dakotas. I mean, they have barely anybody in it. You'd hardly be moving anybody out. And especially if you did it in the same way we do Zionism, right? Like, Americans don't force Jews to go to Israel, but at the same time, Israel's there if you want it. You know what I mean? I would love to see something like that amongst the natives. And I think Tecumseh is actually a good representation of how that could work in a sort of pan-tribal unity. Although at his time, I think the cultures were still separated enough that it might not have worked.
Yeah, and I mean, just to speak of current atrocities that America is still committing, and nobody talks about. I talk about it, but hardly anybody's talking about anymore. Is that we still have brown kids in cages on our southern border right now. I call them concentration camps because I can't figure out any other word for it. I know the right gets triggered by that, but it's the fucking truth. And we need to end that now. They have stayed open during this pandemic, and we know how coronavirus spreads through these facilities. It's an atrocious behavior on the American government's part right now. And unfortunately, all the Americans seem blind to it.
Well, and there's even, there's a lot more we could go into with a lot of atrocities, right? Because, I mean, to be clear, and this is one thing we'll probably agree on, despite the fact that I'm right wing, and I assume you're probably left wing, right?
Oh yeah. I'm a self-proclaimed hard leftist. Sometimes I think I'm an absolute socialist. Sometimes I'm like, I'm still a progressive, but I would definitely say progressive, moving socialist.
Well, and so something that you and I would probably be able to agree on, across the ideological divide, is one atrocities. The one that has been my personal focus for a lot of time has been the forever wars, right? We go into Iraq and we stay in Iraq for the next 20 years. Not that anything else is not worthy, but just that that's one of the things that's always been a huge focus of mine because they literally never end. I mean, I say 20 years, but we've actually been in Iraq since 1991. I mean, it's insane. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I think it was FDR. I could be wrong about the president. I'm pretty sure it was FDR that warned us about the industrial military complex, and we didn't listen to him. They have completely taken over. Eisenhower, yeah. They have completely taken over. They get the largest cut of the money anywhere. People say we can't pay for universal health care, we can't pay for free college, we can't pay for this, we can't pay for that, we can't give individuals money for a stimulus package, but yet they can give the industrial military complex enough money to conquer this world if we chose to. It's disgusting, and it's time for that shit to change, but it never will.
And unfortunately, I think you're right on with that. So politicians are pretty corrupt. But not to get completely derailed though, because the reason that I point those things out, and point out how I feel about the Native American Holocaust and how I feel about the forever wars and stuff like that is just to say nothing that I said in Skylar's conversation, in my debate, or in this conversation is meant to what's the word? The opposite of condemn. I'm losing it right now. Why? Endorse. Is meant to endorse anything that the Americans did. Rather, the question would be, so let's take a modern example instead of the World War II example, right? When Russia invaded Crimea, a lot of American politicians, left, right, and center, were real up in arms about it, right? Like, you're not allowed to do this. This is a violation of treaty, so on and so forth, all of this other stuff, right? And without condemning anything like that, Putin's actions, I simply asked the question, what are we doing in Iraq? If what Putin is doing is wrong, what are we doing in Iraq? And the interesting thing about that is a lot of people, once again, left, right, and center, would justify us going after Putin, even though that justification would justify Putin in going after us, right? And so it's not so much, because I understand what you're saying, like, yeah, I can judge the Nazis simply because it's Nazi ideology. Absolutely. But my question is, if you're a Native American supremacist, for example, right? Then why is it that you can justify yourself when your justifications would end up justifying your opponent in condemning you also, right? Does that make sense?
Kind of. So nations always do horrible shit. I think the point and the hope would eventually be to get to where we see we're all one and it's just one world. Unfortunately, religion instills fear in people to even think of that notion, especially in Christianity with Revelations. But when it comes to like what Putin's doing and what we're doing in Iraq, I am anti-war. I'm not for war of any kind, unless it's brought on us. I think our initial reaction in Afghanistan was justified so long as it was an it equivocated to what had actually happened to us. They took 2,000 of our lives. I think a simple bombing run. Well, I don't know. I know that people get all nationalistic and shit. But like when it comes to Putin's a different character. We're talking about an authoritarian. We're talking about somebody that has completely different ideology than what we are supposed to stand for. Now, I've always maintained that, I like to use the Gladiator quote, there was a dream that was Rome by Marcus Aurelius, right? There's always been a dream that was America, and we're slowly getting there. I might have even said something of that, like when we debated taking the statues down. Right. We're slowly getting there, and that's what I truly believe. Putin is the opposite of that. He has taken Russia right back to that authoritarian. It's not communism anymore. He's embraced Christianity. He's used Christianity to substantiate his power. But we're talking about a man that kills Americans. We're talking about a man that killed an American journalist. No, I'm thinking about the Saudi Arabia guy. But he has killed journalists in his own countries, as far as I know of. So it's a different monster when you're talking about being against an authoritarian superpower, right? So it's a different, but I see what your point about America, and I call that shit out too. I think I'm very alone sometimes when I call it out, and I don't go far enough. Like I used to really get on the edge with some of my criticisms of the military, and the feedback you get from it is really, it makes it almost not worth it, because you're looking over your shoulder, even as small as I was at that time, you're always looking over your shoulder, because if it's just the wrong person in your city saw that shit and they recognize you, it could lead to a bad situation. But anytime you call out the troops or what America does, because people had these nationalist goggles on all the fucking time. And I think Trump exasperates that, but in a false way, because, now these Republicans and Trumpians are actually supporting Putin. And that's probably another reason why you would fall into some really hard fire back when it comes to Putin right now, because we on the left can see what's happening on the right, and it's pretty disgusting.
Well, and I do want to kind of, because I think there's a lot of stuff that I could certainly comment on that with as well, but I do want to kind of, I'm not going to lie, I'm bad at derailing conversations. So
I don't want to spend too much time on this, because I'd like to get to the rest of your criticisms of the review, and then I've got a couple pages worth of questions for you. So.
For sure.
But I want to get into the biblical shit, definitely. Audience, I know you're probably like, let's get into the biblical shit.
Well, and I guess to put it a little bit more, because you do make a good point with the fact that like nations are kind of just bad a lot of times, for lack of a better term, or maybe that is just the right term, but to maybe take it down more to the individualistic level, right? Hypothetically speaking, let's say you were a Native American supremacist and I was a white supremacist, right? Or probably Jewish supremacist would be best, because we both have white skin, but we have different ethnicities there. What would be, if you were to condemn me for saying, hey, he wants his ethnicity to be superior to other people, that would also condemn you, right? And so wouldn't that, in a sense, maybe it's a little bit of a too cool clay, and I'll acknowledge that for a second, but wouldn't that in a sense kind of nullify the criticism you were giving me as a Jewish supremacist if you were also a Native American supremacist?
Well, yeah, and I understand that these different supremacist groups kind of fight against each other, but then you get them into a room and they will agree with each other. Like, there was what's his name, like JF, whatever, the really funny Canadian, or not funny, disgusting Canadian dude that is really just crazy, right? Right before, it was probably really the beginning salvos of Non-Sect Dying, because it was a really controversial stream that they had him on with a black supremacist. And when you have a supremacist on, you need somebody that's going to be able to sit there and really combat what they're laying down. When you have two supremacists on, well, then you have two people agreeing with each other, but just about their own race. And it was a catastrophe of a mistake. So I see what you're saying, but as an outsider looking in at those two people kind of colliding like that, I denounce all of that. Again, it comes down to, you should be able to denounce really bad ideologies in the effort of progressing the world to the point to where we're not killing each other over resources.
So on that same note, though, would you say it was unjustified as a result for you to criticize me in that hypothetical, and to put it in the grander scale for Americans to bomb, shoot, kill German people? Which, of course, would be soldiers, but they would be still people, right?
Yeah.
Like, in other words, does the fact that you're actively being hypocritical in that moment nullify the actions you take to take out a supposed evil?
Well, but again, my whole point is I don't think that I'm being hypocritical, because maybe I just think differently, because I condemn it all. I condemn, if it's a genocide, it's a fucking genocide. It doesn't matter who does it. I personally haven't committed a genocide, so I can sit here and condemn it. I see your point. Like, if I had committed a genocide, then it would be hypocritical for me to commit a genocide, but I haven't. As long as I'm consistent and call all of it, then no, I'm not being hypocritical in that criticism. And maybe it's just because, you're a young guy, and when it comes to politics, it's you will find that you get better and better as you get older, because there's so much information you have to learn, right? And you have to take into consider. I would actually implore you to continue with that line of thought and denounce it all, and realize that nobody's special. We all make these mistakes, and it's up to each individual to choose not not to. That's what I promote, and that's why I will call out some of the stuff that I call out. And I do remember, like, I questioned your motivations for making that statement. And in that part of the review, I think that I was being just kind of hyper or overly rage going at Smokey, and you just kind of got in the mix, because I don't think that you're a racist. I think that I said it in the chat, a scholar of fiction last night. I think you're a pretty decent dude. I just think that you have some really bad ideas. And I think that you're also very young, and you are going to continue to grow in your mind, and especially if you like to read and research, you're just going to get smarter and smarter and be able to reason these things out for yourself as you do naturally as you age.
Well, and I think that's a satisfactory answer. I think both points certainly been made on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to my next question there. Appreciate the cordiality in the answer as well, because honestly, I got to say really quick, because it is important. You and Digital Gnosis and Skylar Fiction have all, been treating me immensely well. And Matthew Steele, who I'll be debating here soon. So I just want to point that out, because there is this notion in the Christian community that atheists are just interested in jumping down our throats and ripping our heads off and stuff like that. And all four of you have treated me very well. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And that, again, has been a growth, because I think when I first started streaming, I did a lot of that, and it's just, you get better and better at the conversations. And I think I've really gotten to the point to where rage doesn't really come out unless it's well deserving. If you're, one of the things that really triggers me is bigotry and homophobia and stuff like that. So when that doesn't happen, I've been able to really kind of evolve and into having and wanting healthy conversations, as opposed to, everybody knows I really love the dumpster fires, and I still do, but I prefer these healthier conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to move on then, so we don't, waste all of our time here. Because I just noticed, I think we've already been on here, 28 minutes, and I only asked you one question.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, and that's what I like about you, is that it feels like I can talk freely with you. So yeah, go ahead, and I'm gonna hope to get through all of mine.
Yeah, for sure, and I appreciate that also. So another point I wanted to point out in the review that you did. So you said that God was committing acts of murder, right? And this is a very common thing for not really just atheists, but just anybody who doesn't believe the Bible, right? That's one of the objections that they would levy. And the point that I had made is, it's not really possible for a God to murder, because murder by definition is unlawful killing. I was asked in that chat, actually, if genocide was murder, and by a strict definition of the word, which, by the way, does not mean that it's moral. I just want to be clear. But by a strict definition of the word, no, genocide is not murder, because it's lawful according to the law. You can call it many different things. You can call it immoral, you can call it evil, all that kind of stuff. And you can call it homicide, right? Because it certainly is. But by a strict dictionary definition of murder, war, genocide, even terrible things like a quote unquote justified cop killing. And I said that wrong. What I meant is, we
do have things like war crimes, the Geneva Convention. Genocide is a crime.
Right, but notice genocide is not considered a crime. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. Genocide is not considered murder, even though it is considered a crime, right? It's its own separate category. We punish people for genocide, but
it's worse than murder.
Say again?
It's worse than murder. It's genocide. It's the murder of thousands. It's genocide. It's worse than murder. So yeah, it's its own crime. Just like, hate crimes are deservedly their own crimes.
Well, right, but notice with a hate crime, you are still charged with a murder. And I guess my point is, right, if the law says a certain killing is legal, justified, understandable, or etc., right, then since murder is defined as an unlawful killing, that particular killing can't be strictly defined as murder unless some greater law would define it as so. The death penalty is a good example of this. And we just use the example of genocide, but also warfare is a good example of this, right? We don't call soldiers murderers per se, although obviously with some war crimes we do, but we do acknowledge the fact that they are killing soldiers, taking lives, so on and so forth, right? And the reason I think that that is important is because when you ask the question, is murder wrong for God to do? Is murder something God can do? Did God commit murder? So on and so forth. The question kind of sounds inherently a little bit flawed. And I think a better way to word it would be, is it wrong for God to kill somebody? Because it's the same action, but murder it's loaded by virtue of its definition.
All right. So this was going to be one of my questions to you. So is it murder if you kill somebody in anger?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to be fair, it does depend on the legal things there. If we were in the wild with no law, technically, unless I assume some higher law, which I do, i.e. the Christian law, no, because there's no law to hold me accountable. But right now, we're in a civilized society that is rightly defined murder. If I haul off and murder somebody in anger, or kill rather somebody in anger, absolutely, that is a murder for sure. And by the way, in the jungle, that example, I would still consider it immoral, just to be clear.
Well, and that's the thing. So the Bible clearly says, now, a lot of people. All right, so Genesis clearly says that God wanted to kill mankind out of anger because they had displeased him. That's a passionate crime out of anger. He took pity on Noah, and I know, me and Smokey, he's in the chat now. We're gonna have a conversation about this on Modern Day Debate.
That'd be good.
We got to set it up, but he'll say that in Peter 2, they talk about Noah preaching, but Genesis says the opposite. God clearly killed the entire world out of anger because we displeased him. So how could you not call that murder?
Well, so there's a couple things. And it's a great question, by the way. I mean that. So the first thing is, I wouldn't call it murder for the same reason I wouldn't call the killing in the jungle murder, just because there does need to be some higher law that dictates that the killing is unlawful. I would argue that God is, and this is kind of a tough concept emotionally. I will freely acknowledge that. But if you want to get technical, every life that has ever been taken in the grand scheme of things was taken by God, right? He's the sole giver and taker of life at all. I ran into this issue, interestingly enough, with Skylar yesterday, where, and he, rightfully so, he pointed out that my ethical theory cannot be properly explained simply by the nature of God. And that's actually, as it turns out, upon some further introspection, that's true. Most crimes against God can be explained as a go against his nature, but there are certain crimes, for example, the taking of life, that it's not necessarily that they go against God's nature, but they step on his toes, right? And to give you a perfect example, right, we could say, from the Christian perspective at least, that accepting worship is immoral. But it wouldn't make any sense to say that God, that it's opposite of God's nature, right, for him to accept worship. So then how do we justify that accepting worship is wrong if morality is based in God's nature? And I think the answer is it's not solely based in his nature, but also in his authority, right? He has the authority over life and death. We as human beings do not. And so that's why I think when he takes life, I wouldn't consider it to be a murder. Whereas when we take life, since we don't have that authority, I would consider it to be a murder. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, but yes and no. So, and that was literally what I titled that stream was, "It's okay because God did it," right? So I wanted to save this for the very last question, but I gotta shoot it out for you now. I wrote it first, but I even put it in quotes, save for last. It applies right here. Why wouldn't you hold your God to a higher standard than your God holds you to?
Well, I think it does genuinely depend on the issue. So for the vast majority of issues, I actually would. The acceptable number of rapes for God to commit, for example, would be 0, right? Whereas you could argue from a Christian perspective that if somebody genuinely had an extreme change of heart, God put them through the ringer in a punishment, right, that they could indeed have some level of redemption. Although rape is a pretty tough one with that. Maybe an easier one to use is like stealing from somebody or something along those lines. In my experience, at least, nobody who commits sexual crimes ever really is very repentant. But nonetheless, right, with other things, for example, accepting worship and taking life, I expect him to do those things. It's not necessarily that, and the reason is because he's the one. I think of it like him. I'd start multiple sentences one on top of another, and it gets confusing. So let me back up for a second. If we look at God as an author, right, writing a fiction, which, by the way, you had mentioned in the live chat with Skylar, or maybe it was in the debate. I'm not sure which one, but I noticed it was you. Why I always bring up Star Wars? Well, because fiction is the closest we can get to examining humans creating in the way God does, and Star Wars is just readily available to everybody. It's very popular.
I think it's a good analogy because I consider the Bible fiction. So.
Well, fair enough, right? What I would say is, if we look at God in that way, right, in the way that he is the author of this book, which we would call reality, right, or movie script, or whatever you want to call it, right? There are certain things which he is in the end, ultimate and sole doer of, right? For example, when George Lucas wrote down Darth Vader throwing Sidious down a hole, George Lucas wrote that. And therefore, Darth Sidious's life in that universe, in an ultimate sense, was taken by Lucas. And then my question in that case would be, what exactly is the difference between him taking that life at the age of 108 and taking that life at the age of 1, especially when you consider that there is the concept of the second death in Christianity, where taking somebody's earthly life is not necessarily taking their ultimate life, right?
Well, and that goes back to the question: why wouldn't you hold your God to a higher standard than he holds you? If you're going to sit here and say that it's immoral to kill babies, it would be wrong, right? I assume that you would admit that it would be wrong for a parent to kill their child. And I'm sure that you would say that it's wrong because of God. And Skylar answered this question fairly well last night. But if it's wrong for you to do it, it would be wrong for God to do it. You're saying that because God writes out the world, right? And I've often used analogies like that, like if God exists, then we have to be a soap opera for it, because it literally must be an amusement for it. But it doesn't make much sense, because you have to hold God to that higher standard. God is supposed to be a perfect being, and all-knowing being. Unless you're going to take the omnis from your God and stop calling it Yahweh, then I don't really see how you can get to or get past the fact that your God demands more of you than it's willing to do itself. It murdered the world when it flooded the world, and I've heard a lot of apologetics for it recently. It's why did God kill the innocent babies? Well, it's because they automatically go to heaven. Well, why is that guaranteed? For one, tell me in scripture where it says babies automatically go to heaven. And then for two, God killed them because their souls were so decrepit, right? We offended that thing so much that it tortured all of the world, and it was going to do it to every single thing on the world, except it caught pity because one man was enslaved to it enough. One man had enough faith in it that God pitied that man and his family. So I don't understand how you cannot hold God to the same standard that your God would hold you. In fact, if it's a perfect being, if it's an all-powerful being, you should hold it to a much higher standard.
Well, and again, with many different crimes, in fact, the vast majority of crimes against God, I indeed would. The reason I think it's different in this particular example is because the only actual way for God to avoid taking life would be for us to already be in heaven and be immortal, right? Because in the end, even when the 108-year-old granddad dies peacefully in his sleep, it's God who put the period on that man's life, and you could attribute that death to God if you want. And this is, by the way, like I said, I know this is a tough concept emotionally for a lot of Christians to grasp, because they like to think of, the devil is the one who takes everybody's lives. But that isn't a biblical concept. There are certainly things the devil does, absolutely. But the biblical view of life is that God is the sole giver and taker.
Well, I'm saying, my answer to you is that if God is what you're saying it is, then it wouldn't be taking the life of babies, innocent children. It wouldn't be taking the life of the innocent. You would at least have a chance to sin, because in the justification that I'm hearing is that, well, they get to automatically go to heaven. Again, like, where does it say that in scripture? Because it doesn't. And then why would God not give them the chance at a full life? Why, you talk about free will, but in the same breath you say God chooses when we live and when we die, and that just doesn't seem to compute to me. If God was moral, wouldn't he allow every human being the chance to at least get to know him and make it into heaven?
Well, yeah. Well, yes and no. Because that's a great question, and I think it's a complicated answer. And let me kind of explain why. So there is a point, I believe, at least, and perhaps you don't share this belief, but if you don't, that's perfectly all right. All right, we are here in a discussion. There is a point I think every society can reach when the forces outside of one's own will are so evil and so degraded that it becomes nearly impossible for that person to avoid falling into the same traps. And God, one of the interesting things about being omniscient is, if you think about it, omniscient would mean you also know that which did not occur. In other words, God, hypothetically speaking, should be fully aware of what would happen in Rage and Jay's life had they decided to never speak with each other on August 2nd of 2020, right? Knowing that and postulating what I do, which is that there is a point in time when a society can get so corrupt that it just will corrupt the people there. When they're so abused, in other words, by the society around them, that it becomes almost and virtually impossible for them to not join in the abuse, right? I would argue that at that point in time, and God being the sole person who can actually determine when that is, because he would be the only person who could see it, right? That there wouldn't really be, I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a mercy per se, because the idea of mercy killing, I'm not going to lie, I do kind of, there's a part of me that thinks that mercy killing doesn't make any sense. So,
well, and that's the justification I hear for the genocide of the Canaanites, is that, well, it was such a rotten society, it was such an evil society that God is doing those babies that were put to the sword a service. And again, it's like, well, those babies will get to go to heaven. And I'm like, where does it say that? Because I've never seen it. How, it's just the justification is well, it's a mercy. God knows what they would grow up to be. So, it's almost taking away from the Israelites, that the Israelites could actually take those babies and reform them into good, God-fearing people. Those babies had to be put to the sword, and those Israelites were ordered to do so. Is it not wrong that God ordered the Israelites to kill the innocent babies of the Canaanites and the 5 other nations that were surrounding them?
Well, one of the things that I think we kind of forget, I think, when it comes to a lot of these conversations is, it would be nice if things did fit in the way that we all wanted them to fit. And I share very much the struggle that a lot of atheists have with, these kinds of issues, because I would absolutely adore to see these babies growing up and living good and healthy and clean lives, right? But the overwhelming likelihood, if God continues to play by the rules he has set in motion, which is a certain level of naturalism and a certain level of free will, that's not really how nations work, right? If I go to a nation and I kill all the sinful people in that nation, what will likely happen, in fact, what is almost inevitable, is those people will grow up, adopt some aspect of that culture, and start to hate me and want to fight me and want to kill me, or start to, even worse, potentially pervert me, and so that I end up being exactly the same as the people I just judged, right?
Well, I mean, if you're a baby and you have no memory, you're not going to remember any of it as a baby, right? Like, you don't have the function to remember. Like, you could have maybe brief glimpses, but you wouldn't really understand what it is. I know I know that there's some people that can actually have memories from infancy, but I think it's really, really rare. As a baby, if you're adopted into a culture, you're going to become that culture.
Maybe as a single baby, but you have to take into account, right?
How? So even if it's like a whole group of babies, like if it's 1,000 babies, all of those babies are going to grow up thinking they're Israelites. They're not going to grow up thinking they're Canaanites. They're never going to, they never even will know that they were Canaanites unless you tell them, right?
Well, and to be fair, though, there's a couple things you got to note there, right? One, I don't know exactly what a Canaanite would look like, but it's possible that they ethnically look different. In fact, it seems to be implied.
I don't think so. I think that, I mean, if you look at history, I mean, I'll I'm not speaking as an expert. I'll reach out to Dr. Josh and see if I'm right about this, but the area, they were generally all the same skin tone, maybe some darker reflections, but in that area, it was, Jews were brown back then, so they looked like the peoples around them.
Well, and so my one piece of evidence, and I want to make clear that it is a one, because I definitely could be wrong about this. This is a little bit of a hypothetical, but I have other things that are not so hypothetical, but I do just want to get to, like, this is one of the ethnic differences, could be one of the points. So the Bible seems to indicate that Canaanites are actually Cushite, which I assume, the Bible doesn't explicitly say this, but I assume all Cushites of the African descent.
The Canaanites descended from Noah, right?
Well, right, but so I think that there's a little bit of a separation. The only reason I say that is because I don't know from a biblical perspective if races as we know of them would be established by Noah's time. I think that would be a little bit later. I don't know how fast. I honestly, I will admit to being a little confused.
I mean, biblically, really, honestly, this is kind of what I love about Christians, because they don't really seem to have a firm understanding of Old Testament, of this story, and then they get upset with me because I do. God didn't create Adam and Eve first. God created all, nations of men. He created, I mean, it clearly says he created men and women and put them throughout the world before he made Adam and Eve. Christians don't like to talk about that.
All right, go ahead. Actually, I'm cutting you off. My apologies.
Well, Christians don't like to talk about that. They like to pretend like we all come from this Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and we didn't. I guess we did, in a sense, that God committed the biggest genocide in the history of the world and killed the entire world, and only Noah survived, and Noah did biblically descend from the Garden of Eden. But Genesis is pretty clear that humans were made before they were made during the creation. After the creation, he made Adam and Eve.
So I would push against that. So I think
I can bring up the Bible passages,
right? God creates Genesis. God creates man and women. God creates men and women. In Genesis 1 on day 6, and then in Genesis 2,
he creates man and woman in his own image on day 6, and then creates Adam on day 7 in the garden. I think it was day 7, might have been day 8. I think it was day 8.
And I think what we have is there's a little bit of, and there's two different interpretations on this particular passage for the overwhelming majority of Christian history. And I don't want to strictly make an appeal to authority, because that's certainly not an argument in and of itself. But it was commonly understood amongst Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic, and etc. And of course, back in the day when those terms may not necessarily apply, that Genesis 1 was kind of like the headline, if you will. And then Genesis 2 was like the paragraph within the headline. So imagine car crash kills 9 people. And then there was a car driving down I-80, right? And it's going over the story, even though the first portion already did go over the story in a more general sense. There's nothing in Genesis 2 that actually says that, it's a day 7 or day 8 or anything like that. Rather, what we see is a specific focusing in Genesis 2 upon, namely, Adam and Adam in the garden. Now, one of the arguments a lot of people do tend to bring up at this point is like, okay, well then what about Cain, right? Cain went off to the land of Nod. He married a wife, which means there was people there. And my point simply to that is just
I'm looking at it right now. You're completely wrong. Genesis 2 starts with, thus the heavens and the earth were completely in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. This is the accounts of the heaven and earth. And then it moves on, Genesis 2 does, to creating Adam in the Garden of Eden. It goes on. This is the account of the heavens and earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up.
So let's pause for a second, right? He can't possibly be talking about what he just talked about, because he already said there was plants on the earth. So clearly Genesis 2 is backing us up.
It's considerably contradictive. So you have to create an apologetic for it. Why it's contradictive. Never does it say it's going back. It progresses as a story. It just contradicts itself, because God didn't do all of that. So I think the best argument for Genesis is an argument for evolution. That was going to be one of my questions is, do you believe in evolution or do you believe in creationism?
I am a creationist, yes.
So it literally does not make sense from a creationist point of view. It only makes sense that God would have his hands in evolution, and that this is some allegory and not literal. I get in trouble when I read it literally, but that's the problem. Creationism takes it literally. So that's the thing. It contradicts itself, but it never says it's going back in time. It clearly says, we'll go back to Genesis 1, just because it's very specific in its language. I remember covering it. Let me find when he actually right here. So then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, increase, blah, blah, blah. I give you my favorite passage. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth. Weed should be legal, but like it clearly says that, and implies, once they come out of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, that they come out into nations that pre-exist. And I think most Christians agree with that there were, there were nations of men outside of the Garden of Eden already once Adam and Eve were cast out. And I can get into that chapter as well, but I don't want to spend the whole stream reading Bible verse.
Right. And so what I would say is there is a little bit, I think, of a presupposition that goes into the interpretation of this on both sides. Let me kind of explain what I mean. You could argue that these are contradictory, right? That certainly could be the case. It could also be that this is something that is, like I said, let's use the newspaper example, right? You could argue that the newspaper contradicts itself when, without warning, it goes back in time to explain the situation that it put in its brief summary, right? Or you could argue that this is a summary in this first portion, and the second portion, right? In other words, you have to kind of assume the bad intentions at first. If you assume the person is not having bad intentions and that they wrote their own they read their own writing, right? Then this is a contradiction which they probably would have caught, right? And by the way, just to be clear, a lot of people have the documentary hypothesis. I do not agree with the documentary hypothesis.
I think the debate, didn't Moses write this himself?
That is my belief, yes. Consensus is
for one, Moses is supposed to be God's dude, should be able to write it to where it doesn't contradict itself, don't you think?
Well, right, but that's actually part of my point, right? Is what I'm saying is we could look at this as, oh, look at that. That's a very obvious and blatant contradiction. Or we could look at this and say, Moses probably knew what he wrote in Genesis 1 and wrote Genesis 2 in that context.
Well, but I'm saying though, was Eve made in the image of God? Wasn't she made from Adam? That context of Genesis 1 doesn't fit the context of Genesis 2. It doesn't fit the Garden of Eden story and all that happens after that. That context is God made man and woman in his image and spread them throughout the land.
Well, so let's go ahead and actually look at the verses here real quick. And I know you just read them, but I just want to read them again. I'm on Genesis 2 right here. And I want to start specifically where it forms Adam. So just a moment. Let me find that here real quick. And garden, Python. Oh, you know what? I skipped over it. My apologies. I am completely reading this. I was reading all the way down where he's spreading the rivers. Listen, sanctified, these are the generations of the heavens of the earth, that they were created in the day that the Lord made the earth and heavens and every plant in the field. And there went up from a mist. And then the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Now, we could have two possible positions of looking at this, right? We could say on one end, okay, first off, this is only man. It's not man and women. And second off, Genesis 1 just already said that men and women were already made. So this appears to be a contradiction. Or we could say, well, once again, I think, and this is assuming, of course, that Moses is the writer, but nonetheless, Moses probably wrote this in the context of having just written down, because it's only, I mean, in fact, he didn't even have chapters, right? We added the chapters and verses later on. Moses was not writing in chapters. So he's probably writing this with the context of knowing that the page he just finished said what it said. And yet here now he's saying that this is the formation of men and women. So now how could this possibly work if we take that perspective? Well, there's a couple ways. I already explained the first way, which is or not the first way, the first point, because there's really only one way, but that you have the summary followed by the description of the summary. But the creation of Adam, and this is the second point, the creation of Adam is actually the creation of both male and female, because Eve comes out of Adam. And this is actually a theological point Christians have pointed out rather frequently for completely separate reasons that we shouldn't necessarily get into now because it would completely derail the conversation. But to discuss the, quote, bride of Christ coming out of Christ, right? So when Adam is made, since within Adam was the person of Eve, within Adam was created the entire human race. Furthermore, there is no necessary, at least, necessary, right? It could be multiple days. But the Bible doesn't explicitly state that there was multiple days between Adam and Eve's creation. So this could all hypothetically be happening in a single day. That's another point that, we do have to kind of address, because it's not saying explicitly, and then add,
Here's the problem with that interpretation, though, is that God was actually in the garden. So in the context of Genesis 1, God is creating everything. He's got 7 days to create the entire universe, and he does it somehow, some way. God is great, right? But in Genesis 2, God is actually in the garden. It specifically talks about him walking through the garden, feeling the breath of air on his face. He's with Adam and Eve in the garden. He's not in the creation anymore.
So I guess I'm a little confused. Please forgive me. What is the question there, I guess?
Well, you're trying to say that this is that Genesis 1 was the creation, right? And Genesis 2 is going back and describing God, whatever he did during the creation, but God was literally in the Garden of Eden during Genesis 2 and not doing the creating. He was like, I've made fun of it, called it like the game of hide and seek, where, he comes back and he's chilling with Adam and Eve and he can't find them.
I get it.
You know what I'm saying? And Adam has to show himself because God couldn't find him. I have fun with it, but that's the issue that I'm having with your narrative, is that God, for one, like, to me, a story moves on, but I understand that you can't take the Bible from the beginning to the end. It's written in a different way, but I do believe that you have to take the chapters from beginning to end. And to me, it doesn't read like it's going back to the creation. It reads like he did the creation, and then he went into the Garden of Eden.
Well, let me ask you a question, because it is related. Do you know Genesis 11 and 12 very well, by chance?
I haven't studied them recently. I haven't quite got there with my more recent Bible study. I just don't have a lot of time for Bible study, and I always turn them into videos. Or the next one I think is going to actually be a live stream, so we might actually get to Genesis 11. I'm pretty familiar with Genesis, so I'll probably understand what you're talking about. It's just I haven't looked at Genesis 11 recently. I can pull it up right now, though.
Okay. Well, specifically verse 31, if you're going to pull it up, which is the very last, actually. So Genesis 11, and actually, you know what? You might want to start at 27. But Genesis 11:27 through 31 explains, in going down all these genealogies, it eventually gets to Taran and his sons, one of which is Abram, soon to be known as Abraham. And then it ends with them actually going to the city of Haran, right? And then Genesis 12:1 starts with the promises, Genesis 12:1 through 3, with the promises that are going to be given to Abram in particular, and why he's going to Canaan in the first place, right? And there is no indication necessarily of where the time frame here is, right? And actually, you see this in Genesis. Yeah, no, never. I can't go on another one because I'll confuse people. The point being that when Abram is sitting there getting the promises that he's getting from God, right? One could argue, okay, well, didn't in Genesis 11:31 you just leave and come to Haran? So now you're being promised the promised land to come to Haran. That didn't, we never had an indication that we were going back in time. In fact, this is an argument that I just recently saw a Yale professor of Hebrew studies point out, because he believes in the documentary hypothesis. And he said this is a clear example of two different sources being added, because what is starting in Genesis 12:1 has already happened in Genesis 11:31. And that's one way you could look at it. But another way you could interpret it is that they are, once again, going back. They were being very general in Genesis 11. This is the lineages, and so begat so-and-so and did this, and so-and-so begat so-and-so and did this. And then Genesis 12, and now they're starting to be specific for the point of the narrative.
All right, so we're going to agree to disagree on Genesis and all of that, because like the point was Canaan the Canaanites, and why it's okay for God to put their babies to the sword. And like I probably helped us get madly derailed from that, but I could actually probably have a conversation with you, and the whole stream could be about like what does Genesis say about the creation of mankind, because I think that we could have a long conversation that would be very interesting about that. But like my question is, like, what would justify God ordering the Israelites to put the sword to the babies? And we kind of expanded it to like 1,000 babies could be incorporated, 1 million babies, 1 billion babies could be incorporated to Israel, and so long as they weren't told that they were Canaanites, even if they were of a different color, they could be told a different thing and be raised to be not Canaanites, right? So, I mean, that's why everything always goes back to the babies, because I think at a certain level of childhood, Christians would see that a child is like capable of sin or something, but a baby, there's no question that these babies could not be incorporated into a society or become that society. That there's nothing that these babies did to deserve being put to the sword, especially if you consider, going back to Genesis, that the whole beef with the Canaanites came from Ham, Noah's son, seeing him drunk and naked. God didn't have issues with Noah being drunk and naked. He had issues with Ham, who accidentally seen Noah drunk and naked, and didn't even punish Ham, punished Ham's son Canaan, right? So, I mean, that's where this whole beef with the Canaanites starts. And God told Noah's other two sons that Canaan and his descendants would be the slaves of them. So it just doesn't make sense that these babies, that it could be justified morally in any way whatsoever, that these babies being put to the sword by the Israelites, commanded by God himself through Moses, and then later was it Joshua, I believe, that would be moral for God to do that.
Well, let's use a more modern example to kind of illustrate the point, right? Now, obviously, there's a significant cultural and color difference when it comes to Native Americans. Obviously, I mean, I am pasty, right? Whereas a full-blooded Native American is actually going to be significantly browner than most brown people on the planet, right? I guess that depends on the region, but at least here on the West, they are. I get called into question for my heritage because I admit I look very, very white. There are certain features that I can point out that, hey, but I hear what you're saying on that. It drives me crazy sometimes. I try not to talk about it in real life because
people just, nah.
I definitely feel that. In fact, to be honest with you, I think considering my own Jewish ethnicity, we might have a little bit of common ground there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But in that example, right? So we have, and now to be fair, obviously there's a separation in that I don't think that the United States government was, I mean, it was just an atrocious thing. But ignoring that for a second, just for the sake of the argument, we did actually try to take these other Native Americans after we did all this destruction, right? And try to incorporate them into our culture. And it failed tremendously, right? To this day, there are Native Americans who are horribly anti-America. They hate the country. There's a lot of anti-white racism. And I would say
well, yeah. And that's because we didn't kill all of them. Like America let their foot off the throttle a bit early and didn't kill all of them. We're talking about in the Bible, they killed all of them. I mean, none was spared. I mean, that was the law. It was revenge for God. It's very specific about that. It was revenge for God.
Well, and that is true. But if you go through the narrative, right, one of the things you'll end up seeing, and if you think about it, this actually kind of makes sense. Like, for example, we'll take the Jericho example, right? The walls come tumbling down and the army comes in. I mean, the likelihood that not one guy ran away fast enough is really small. In fact, there's probably groups of people who ran away fast enough, right? And that's not even acknowledging the fact that Joshua actually made covenant with some Canaanites that kept them around. But if you go towards the end of Joshua, beginning of Judges, one of the things you start to figure out is Joshua didn't actually finish the job. He did take his foot off of the throttle, and as a result, there were other people around.
The Canaanites weren't the only ones. I can't remember the name of there were 6 nations that God ordered that everyone be put to the sword, and not just everyone, the fucking animals too. Right, it was brutal, and I just don't see how you can sit there and justify that genocide is moral, that God ordering genocide is moral. We know you don't truly believe. You don't truly believe that it's moral for our societies. We talked about this earlier, to commit genocide. So you cannot believe that it's moral for God to order it. You cannot hold God to a higher standard than we hold ourselves here as the imperfect beings we are. You know, you just can't do that. And I know you like to say, well, he can take it whenever he wants, but it's just a ridiculous argument. He was literally giving the orders back then. In the conversation with free will, Christians will say that God doesn't interject in the world. Well, he obviously was there. He was giving them fucking orders, and they followed. I mean, the Bible's pretty clear that they carried them out. They tried to. I can't remember the name of the army was ordered to go kill all of them, and they came back with the women and the small children. And Moses looked at them, and it's like, "What are you doing? Kill them all." I mean, you cannot justify that.
So there is, I think, a couple things that I would want to point out there. So the first thing is, and it is an important point, I think, is that, it's not necessarily that Joshua is not doing what he's commanded to do, right? And I'm not saying anything like that. It's not necessarily.
Like, we know for a fact that Moses was, and Moses is the one that I just referred to. Because It was Moses that was like, what are you doing? Kill them all. It wasn't Joshua. It was Moses. And we know Moses had that direct link and he was talking to God and all that. I mean, he was getting his orders straight from God.
Right. And that's in particular the Midianite example.
The Midianites. I couldn't think of their name, the Midianites.
Right. But one of the things that I think is important to stress, at least in the Joshua narrative, right, is that there's actually multiple instances of the foot being taken off the throttle, as you say. And we actually even have a little bit of historical evidence to back this, because it is interesting. Right around the time that Joshua would show up, according to the biblical chronology, it takes a couple of years.
Well, I mean, it shouldn't justify God's order that the human beings, the imperfect human beings, didn't carry them out perfectly. We are imperfect human beings by your worldview, right? So you can't blame the imperfect beings. Why aren't you blaming the perfect being that gave the order?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about because what I'm talking about in particular here is the
Joshua and the Canaanites and whatever. That they didn't. All right, you're saying that there's indications that very few were able to escape, or that they didn't kill very few of them. But that would be the imperfect humans going against the actual orders of God, which by God commanded that those six nations, those 6 nations surrounding Jerusalem, there were different rules for the nations outside of that. But for those 6 nations, everything had to be put to the sword. The crops had to be burned. You couldn't save the food. You had to kill the animals, the men, the women, the old people, the children, and the babies. And what's at issue, and this is why we always go to the babies, is because you can say what you want about those societies, that God was doing a justice to them, that those societies were so wicked that God was doing a justice to them. But those babies were innocent and incapable of committing those sins. That's the true moral dilemma with it, is why would God order that, and how can you say that that's moral?
Well, notice though, in those examples that you give, right, you say like, oh, well, these people took, well, that you say is like the example of imperfect humans, right? They decided not to completely fulfill God's will, and as a result, there are certain Canaanites around. And then look what that ended up causing for the Israelites. For the next 400, 500, 600 years, they were fighting these people. It's not until, consider this, right?
Well, I mean, and it doesn't even really get into the question, like, why didn't God just do it himself? Like, well, you'll say free will, and he didn't want to interject in mankind, but we already saw him do it in the flood. You'll see him do it later with Jesus, right? Like, what is he doing? How is he not interjecting in the world if he's reincarnating himself as a human being? Why didn't he just wipe them off himself? Snap of the fingers, they gone. Their memory is gone. Their memory completely gone. God is capable of that, is he not? Why wouldn't that be moral than putting a damn baby to the sword?
Well, I think, to be fair, there is a difference between, so, and this is how I use the term free will. So perhaps your definition would be different. Perhaps another apologist's definition and the way they would use it would be different. But I don't think that it is a violation of your free will to do an action such as, for example, in this particular case, if I were to take your life, right? Which, by the, just to be clear, it's just hypothetical, right? I wouldn't see that as a imposition on your free will, because you freely can still choose things, right? I didn't limit your ability to choose whether or not you wanted to potentially take my life, or whether or not you might potentially be suicidal, or what have you, right? There is a difference, I think, between telling somebody no or ordering something towards somebody or something like that, and actually legitimately removing their ability to make a choice. Removing the ability to make the choice by virtue of taking away their consciousness in some way, I think is a true violation of free will. I would not argue that things past that, and I know that this is a little bit of,
so like I think you're arguing to my point. Then why didn't he just do it himself? Why didn't he just interject? Like, if these societies were so bad that they had to be wiped off the face of the earth, why not just take them and make them to where nobody, you could literally have the ability to make it to where they're not remembered at all. There's no shoving a blade through a baby's face, neck, wherever you're going to shove it through that little baby, right? Like, I mean, all right, so let me ask you this question. So would you find it immoral, right? Like, say if a United States soldier in Afghanistan, right, finds a baby in an Al-Qaeda hut, let's say, and, would it not be immoral if that soldier were to kill that baby?
Yeah, I would agree to that. Yeah.
So why wouldn't you hold your God to the same standard?
Because like I said earlier, I do believe that when it comes to taking life, that's not something that is a comparable thing with us and God. I think God takes all life. I don't like it when the soldier shows up and shoots the 35-year-old man at his local deli. I find that to be abhorrent. But the 35-year-old man who was shot at the deli at that moment in time had his life taken by God in the ultimate sense, as he would have if he lived another 35 years and died peacefully in his sleep. The reason that killing is wrong is not the same as the reason other sins are wrong. The reason that killing is wrong is because that is an example of human beings basically overstepping their bounds. You don't have a right to condemn another human, to kill another human, or to worship another human, or a couple of other things that are laid out throughout the Bible, not because that's necessarily outside of God's nature, but because that is his position. It's his authority. He takes the life. And to be fair, just to give an example, right, because you argue like, well, why couldn't he just do it himself instead of, sending some of the Israelites to do so, right? And in that regard, I would give the example of a human authority, right? I can't go find a pedophile right now, beat him over the head with a baton, wrap his arms behind his back, and then stick him in a box for the next 10 years. That would be very highly frowned upon by the law, and I would go to jail for that. But if I, the self-same person, go get a badge and uniform from the authorities and do the exact same thing verbatim, well, he's just going to sit in prison for the next 10 years. And the only difference...
Well, I mean, that's not true, because you can make a citizen's arrest. I mean, we do have the right to make citizen's arrest. If you know that a pedophile is being a pedophile, well, I would say it's your moral obligation to turn that pedophile into the authorities, or to make a citizen's arrest if you think you could carry it out. Now, I would highly probably not try to do that. I would have the authorities do it. But you do have that ability to stop that pedophile if you know for a fact it's a pedophile.
Well, do you keep in mind, though, with a citizen's arrest, you can only actually stop somebody if you have actively seen the crime taking place, which virtually has never happened with pedophiles. I'm sure it's happened occasionally. But so in other words, if God forbid, some horrible thing happens.
Well, I mean, your explanation or your thought experiment there included like you would know the pedophile, right? Like you would know it's a pedophile.
Well, see, but that's the thing. If you look at that citizen's arrest, so and let me just kind of lay out the whole thing here. And this is actually something that I happen to be relatively read up on simply because of the Ahmaud Arbery case. It was something that they were tossing back and forth a lot. What exactly is a citizen's arrest? If you know somebody has committed a crime, but you did not actively watch the crime take place. In other words, if a child who has no intention to lie told you of a crime and even had sufficient evidence to back it up, you can't make a citizen's arrest at that point. But if you saw the man touching, grabbing something like that child, at that point, the law does allow you to make a citizen's arrest. And so what my analogy is saying is if you collect that evidence like a cop would, like a detective would, right? The authorities do not allow you to go out and do what is a perfectly justifiable thing simply because of your level of authority. But if you go and get a badge and get the okay of the authorities, right, the exact same action, you no longer have to actively perceive the crime at that point. You just have to collect the evidence, right? The exact same action becomes justified.
My counter would be like, if you didn't see the pedophile be a pedophile, right? Like, then you don't know and you should contact authorities. But the analogy says that you only know if you've seen it, or you have video evidence, you have real, you can assume that it's a pedophile because of the way the dude acts around children, right? Or you could have heard things and you suspect. That's different than this analogy. The analogy states that if you know, then you've seen it. You know for a fact that this is happening, and you could make that arrest. Now, again, I would recommend not doing that, because you could be potentially putting yourself into a very dangerous position, and into a position to where you're not actually going to save that child, because you could be dead and your body severed up a million different pieces. I would suggest that you call the authorities, but you actually do have that ability. And I think most good moral human beings would do something to stop that. Most good moral humans, even in war, aren't going to make the decision to run a sword through a little baby. And if a God is commanding you to do so, you cannot justify that, and you should not follow that. Why would you follow that voice in your head that tells you to kill that baby? It is not, to me, I don't believe in God. I think that these were bad people that did bad shit, and they justified it with this whole God bullshit. And it disgusts me. And I know you're a good dude, but I just don't understand how you can defend the undefendable here. We're talking about babies, and we're talking about swords, clubs, whatever. I mean, I'm sure that there was some baby rape going on because men are disgusting. How could you condone that? And how could you not hold that God to that standard? This is why I do not follow Yahweh anymore, because I see Yahweh as a monster, and you should too.
I actually did not. You notice you said any more there. I did not actually know that about you, which, not that changes anything, just for the record, but little fun facts I learned. But I do want to go back to this example, though, because You say, so if you know something, that implies that you've seen it. But if that were the case, we would never be able to arrest criminals at all. Almost every time, let me rephrase that, almost every time that we arrest and put a criminal behind bars or to death or whatever it is that the law demands we do for that criminal, right? It's usually after the fact, and people have to investigate and put the pieces together in order to actually do that. But if you did that same thing, that is a crime. It's called vigilantism. It's the exact same thing. You go out, you find, right, you investigate, you find the person, you arrest the person, you put them in jail. That would be known as vigilantism. If you actively perceived the crime, it's different. But if you didn't actively perceive the crime and had to do your forensics and then went out of your way to take the law into your own hands, because of the authority that you do not possess, you're not legally allowed to do that. At least in the state of Idaho and Georgia.
I could be wrong about this, but
Idaho is where I live.
I've looked into vigilante law before. I could be wrong, but I think most, when it comes to the law and what's prosecuted in this country, when you're talking about vigilante law, you're talking about violent acts, not so much, like people doing private investigations happens all the time. You can take people with their cell phones recording the police brutalities that's happening right now as vigilante law under that definition, but most vigilante law prosecutions are dealing with violent incidents, I do believe.
Well, let me use the Ahmaud Arbery case as an example because it's fresh in everybody's mind.
I mean, you do agree that Arbery had committed no crime, right?
I don't think it's relevant. I don't know the evidence on that, so I can't say that for sure. I don't think it's relevant, though, because it's still murder regardless. If he committed a crime, if he did not commit a crime, it's still murder regardless. And to be fair, I just have to state, because it has been brought up, I find that to be a poor argument on the conservative side. When they say, yeah, well, George Floyd did this 5 years ago. Not the question. The question is, what did Derek Chauvin do right now, right? So knowing that, though, the Ahmaud Arbery case is interesting because the whole reason you can actually charge the McDaniels, I think is their last name, the whole reason you can charge them with murder in the first place is because the citizen's arrest that they were going to make was illegitimate. And by the way, the Georgia State authorities said that without...
No, you charge them for murder because they murdered him, not because of the citizen's arrest that they were trying to make. I highly disagree with what you're saying right now. They murdered the man, so they get charged with murder.
But that's not 100% the case. Let me explain to you why. Because they actually have explained this over in the court cases, right? The DAs who were trying to figure all this stuff out. Had the McMichaels actually had legitimate cause under Georgia state law to perform a citizen's arrest, and had Ahmaud Arbery done the exact same things that he did do, that would be considered under Georgia state law a justifiable killing because they're actively perceiving him in a crime.
Whatever, Georgia's fucked up backwards anyway. I mean, what would you consider that? So would it be immoral if you're a black man and you had done no crime and a gang of white people come up to you and try to commit a citizen's arrest for a crime you did not commit, and you resist that arrest? I don't find that to be immoral, and I do not find that any justification that those white men should murder Ahmaud Arbery.
A little bit of a misinterpretation because
I mean, I've heard a lot of the right arguments when it comes to the Arbery case, and they want to say because he fought back that these white people were justified for murdering him. I know you're not going there, but if you're a white person out there and you're hearing this and you've argued that, go fuck yourself.
And I would completely agree with that, just for the record. But what you need to understand as far as my point is, right? By the way, I do want to let you know this before it gets to that point. I'm not limited right now, but I got about 15, 20 minutes left.
Yeah, we never really did get to too many questions, but oh well, it's been a good conversation anyway. I think we're both bad at, we're both really bad at allowing ourselves to get derailed, I think.
No kidding. And you know what? There's always next time too, right? So,
well, yeah, I'd love to have you on. Again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, I do find you to be an honest interlocutor, and I love that. And I would love to have you on. And if you doing streams on your channel, I'll come on your channel.
Yeah, absolutely, and I appreciate that greatly. But let me get to kind of the purpose of my point, because it's not that. So if a gang of white people surrounded a black guy who committed no crime and tried to commit a citizen's arrest, and he fought back, that would be self-defense under Georgia state law, which is the law in the Ahmaud Arbery case, right? But if the McDaniels actively perceived Ahmaud Arbery committing a crime and then tried to do a citizen's arrest, and at that point he attacked them, Georgia state law calls that a self-defense killing, right? Notice, though, there's a caveat there.
I know.
He's been actively perceived committing the crime, so they know for a fact he's committed the crime. The reason that that's important in this particular state is because it's funny I said state. I actually meant scenario, but I guess both apply. Is because the citizen's arrest is legitimate if you've actively perceived a crime, and if the citizen's arrest is legitimate, then it's not reasonable to say the criminal was acting in self-defense. Now, in the Ahmaud Arbery case, that's not the case, because he was not actively perceived committing a crime, which is the very reason you charge them with murder, right? They didn't have the right to citizen's arrest. Had there been no murder, they still would be charged with vigilante justice under Georgia state law. Since there was a murder, now they have to be charged with murder under Georgia state law. But had they actively perceived the crime, the killing itself would have been considered justified, because the logic behind the law there is that somebody you know for a fact committed a crime is now attacking you for trying to hold them accountable for that crime, and that would be considered a justifiable self-defense kind of killing, right?
Well, I would have to really look at Georgia law, because I think that the aggression has to somewhat be equivocal to taking a life, I would have to imagine. I do understand that the South can be really, really backwards sometimes. I've lived down there. I understand how it is down there. But I would say, like, if you have a group of white dudes, right, and Ahmaud Arbery was not armed, there was no way he was going to take your life. I do not think that even under Georgia law, maybe, I haven't really looked into this. I don't really care, because fuck the South too, honestly. But, like, morally speaking, it would not be moral. Fuck what the law says anywhere for in that situation, because somebody fought back, because you made the decision to make that citizen's arrest, and you have a group of people. We're talking numerous people against one, no weapons involved. The numerous people had the weapons, right? Not Ahmaud Arbery. So in that situation, I would hope you would agree, it would not be moral to kill him.
Well, let me kind of work.
Unless he was like about to snap somebody's neck or something, right? Like if he got somebody in the death choke, or not even the death choke, but like he's like some kind of combat expert, like martial artist dude, like maybe in that context where his hands are lethal weapons, then maybe it would be justified. But a normal dude trying to resist an arrest is not justifiable for murder.
Well, so let's examine that for a second, though, and keep in mind that Ahmaud Arbery was innocent in this. So we do
but even if he was guilty, just for the case of what I'm saying, even if he was guilty of that and he was resisting arrest, it would not be justifiable to murder him.
Well, so let's follow that train of logic, though, because I understand where you're coming from, but I don't think that you actually believe that. Let me explain why. So Ahmaud Arbery, if we just take the facts and, of course, change it just a little tiny bit to assume he was guilty, and assume that McDaniels watched him commit the crime that they accuse him of, right? Hypothetically speaking, the McDaniel in the truck does not shoot the Ahmaud Arbery, who he has actively witnessed commit a crime. And Arbery then takes the shotgun, which is what he was trying to do, of the other person. Now, all of a sudden, not only is he a criminal, and for a fact he's a criminal, but he's violent and has a weapon that he may or may not actually be wanting to use against you. Obviously, in that case, assuming that he actually committed the crime, assuming you're justified.
Honestly, I think you're making an argument against the Second Amendment here, because this is exactly why normal citizens that haven't been trained efficiently shouldn't have guns, right? Like, so if you're gonna point a gun at somebody, and that person tries to take that weapon that can kill them, that you're pointing at them. Again, to me, that doesn't justify, like, you are the ones that brought these fucking weapons into the equation. He didn't, right? Like, so to me, it's, I don't give a fuck if he was trying to get the gun. I would too. If somebody's trying to kill me, that's life over. Whatever the fuck I just did, whatever the fuck I just did, that's life over for that person, right? So it like, I just don't see how you can justify, and you're not. We're talking a scenario, but like, even if he's guilty, blah blah blah. But I sorry. I tried to replace my microphone today, and I couldn't find one. I'm gonna have to order one offline. I have a short right here, so hopefully it'll stay. But you just can't justify the murder of that man. Now, you might get away with it in the eyes of the law, but I'm talking about morality here. You are not more like he's not posing even says he goes for the gun. He should not have brought that gun into the situation to begin with. So I was saying you're making an anti-Second Amendment argument here. Why normal citizens that have not been trained efficiently should not own weapons, because they'll be putting themselves into a situation to where they can take the life of another. And yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother debate. And Ahmaud Arbery, I could talk about him for hours. This is an issue that I'm very passionate about. You know, we've already had kind of that back and forth on modern day debate. I'm sure you understand that I'm a huge Black Lives Matter supporter. And I've often talked about Tamir Rice and Eric Gardner and all these. I can just give this list of abuses,
Right.
By police. But I mean, the Arbery case isn't even that. That's just the Arbery case is a reflection of the past of America, because it used to be that. It used to be mobs going and lynching Black people, burning crosses in their yards. And I mean, so, you know, that whole issue is far removed, and I understand how we got there, but you know, we could talk about that for hours and hours and hours.
Can I ask one final question on it?
I have a issue with legally justifying murder, and I think it happens too often in this country, where police are allowed to murder, and because they're police, and they have certain immunities, they get away with it. I think that if you're going to find something immoral, it should be immoral. And if you're going to find something immoral as a society, it should be immoral. And too often than not, we have these legal justifications for something that's immoral.
So you actually might have just answered my question, but I want to ask it anyway, just to make sure. Hypothetically speaking, if police witnessed a crime taking place, and police are, of course, armed, right? They witness a crime taking place. They pursue the guy who they have witnessed this crime. The guy knows he's been witnessed, so it's not like he's in the dark here. He's fleeing from them, right? And he ends up going for their firearm. Would they be justified in firing at him? Would a second officer be justified in firing at him if he was going after this cop's firearm, provided that the cop actively witnessed him committing the crime that he was chasing him for?
All right, so I don't know if you've ever been in a police situation. I have several times. So usually in these situations, you have numerous cops, right?
Right.
You at least have the partner in a strategic place. So cops are not just equipped with weapons. If you see a suspect lunge, you can easily use your taser, your spray. You can stop that suspect without taking that suspect's life. Our cops are trained to pretty much assassinate these people in these situations. I know I'll probably get a lot of shit for that, but they're trained to protect their life first, and shoot first, ask questions later. There's a big discussion about training, defunding, all of that. You know, we spend all of these the stupid microphone, if I hit it at all. We spend all of this money on these police forces, but we don't train them accurately. And too often they're not taking life into consideration, and too often they're abusing their powers. And it's one of the things that I really don't understand about the right in this country right now, because they have pretended to be against big government. They have pretended to be like against these authoritarian police forces. But right now they're fully accepting of all of that shit. And they back it up and they support it, and they're against people trying to get their individual freedoms. I retweeted sock account yesterday. It was a perfect retweet. Like conservative Republicans should be on the front lines of the Black Lives Matter protests, but they're not, because they're hypocrites.
That is actually a fully consistent and concise answer. I'm not going to lie. I was not actually expecting that. I was expecting us to do a back and forth on that, but you kind of diffused that. I'll be honest. I'm impressed. I like consistency
Well, I appreciate it. I try to be consistent. That's one thing I try to do, is I pride myself on consistency. And I also pride, because sometimes my positions will change. If I see I'm proven wrong about something, I try to be open about that. I'll look at it and I'll change my position if I need to.
All right. Well, I mean, and shoot, you know what? I probably shouldn't. I was gonna make a quick point, but honestly, I don't know if I actually have time.
Yeah, I know. We'll have to get you back on. I could do this all night, and I didn't get to too many questions. I wanted to ask you about can babies lie, but I'm kind of glad because it's too close to Skylar, and that just happened last night, and you guys had a great back and forth on it, I think. But I did want to ask a couple questions about babies that I didn't get to. But this has been fun. I'd like to have you on for a political conversation and a conversation on the Bible, and we could do it on your channel, and I'm sure we'll have some future modern day debates. I was terrible. I forgot to get your channel description into the your link into the description below. So go ahead and just tell the audience and whoever watched on the playback what your channel is, and I'll make sure to get the link in the description after the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my channel is called the my channel is called the Synagogue. That's Cynicogue. It's a portmanteau of the word cynic, like cynical, and synagogue, like the Jewish place of worship. One word. And what I do there, if you look it up online, what you'll find, it's a kind of a Hebrew caveman with a kind of 1950s getup, wearing kind of a hat like I'm wearing right now. And it's a black and white logo. So that would be the logo you'd be looking for there if you wanted to look it up. What I do on there is I have two programs so far. I have Unapologetics, which is a not strictly apologetics program, but just faith-based in general. And then I have what I call the Watchdog, which is a political journalism, that kind of thing program. So if anybody's interested in those are both on the Synagogue. And yeah, I'm absolutely pleased to have anybody on board for discussions. I have not actually ever done a live stream yet. I'll be doing my first live stream ever on that channel with Skylar tomorrow.
Yeah, I heard about that, man. I really like Skylar, and I liked your guys' back and forth. So I'm hopefully what time is it going to be?
I believe we were shooting around. We haven't gotten a set time, but I believe we were shooting for sometime around 6 p.m., 6:30 around there. Well, 6.
I hate working second shift. I always miss the good shit, dude. I wish I could be in that side chat, but I'll be at work.
Well, to be fair, I think you're Michigan, right?
Yeah.
You might be an hour or two ahead of what I'm talking about. I'm not sure.
Maybe I'll be there. If I can get out of work, hopefully I can watch it live. If not, I'll definitely catch the playback. Yeah,
for sure. And basically what we'll be talking about there actually is just I'm going to ask him a few questions about, because, he's a subjective moralist. And so I just kind of want to probe that and see, his defense of subjective morality as a theory, and hopefully it'll be good. I think it will. I kind of enjoy Skylar quite a bit. It's interesting. I got into that debate knowing a lot more about Tom and having quite a healthy respect for Tom. And now I've been with Skylar twice and also talking to him. And so it's like completely shifted.
Yeah, that's one thing before we end this. I noted that last night you called Skylar an atheist. As far as I know, he's still agnostic. I mean, tomato, I know, but pretty big distinction there. He used to be a deist, and now he's agnostic. I know Dr. Josh, I think, is leaning more towards atheism because he used to be agnostic as well. But I think he might be leaning more towards atheism. But I think Skylar is still agnostic. Just for info, because I heard that yesterday. I'm like, oh, I'll make sure to tell CJ that just so he knows.
Well, and that's certainly, I appreciate that, because that is important to know. And in fact, it makes sense. In my personal experience, this isn't a universal rule by any stretch, but in my personal experience, it does appear that agnostic arguments tend to be better than atheist arguments because they don't.
oh, got me right here in the gut.
Apologize for that.
All right, man, dude, I really appreciate you coming on. This was a lot of fun. It's just refreshing to have a good, clean conversation with somebody. So often it just gets into the mud. And so, yeah, dude, thank you so much for coming on, dude. I know you got stuff to do, so we will get out of here. Audience, thank you guys for being here. And I got a new patron, so I got to fix my Patreon screen. So we'll just be right out tonight. But you guys have a great night, and thanks a lot.
Yeah, and you as well. Shalom.
All right.